Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, How to Complete the Advanced Beneficiary Notice. All lines have been muted. The webinar will last 45 minutes, and we will have dedicated time after the presentation for Q&A. If you have questions throughout, simply type them in, and we will address them during that time. This webinar is being recorded and will be sent to each participant afterwards. Our speaker for today is Jackie Stack. Jackie is a member of the Practice Optimization team. She is a highly accomplished healthcare professional with more than 30 years of experience in healthcare administration, education, and compliance. She was part of AAPC's ICD-10 curriculum development team and served on the NAB. She previously worked at a large multi-physician family care and occupational health practice with 2 locations in northwestern Pennsylvania. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us today. At this time, I will turn the webinar over to Jackie.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar. We're going to go ahead and advance to the agenda, please. So our agenda for today is we're going to talk about the limitation on the liability for our ABNs. We're going to discuss when it's appropriate to use an ABN and when it's not to be used. What modifiers should be used in conjunction with ABNs. The forms, we're going to discuss where the forms exactly need to be filled out, and because with the ABNs, they have to be filled out 100% complete, correct, or they will be rejected. And then also we will have a discussion and some questions as well afterwards. So first we'll start with the limitation on liability. Section 1879A through G of the Social Security Act provides financial relief to beneficiaries, providers, practitioners, physicians, and other suppliers by permitting Medicare payment to be made or requiring refunds to be made for certain services and items for which Medicare payment would otherwise be denied. This section of the Act is referred to as the limitation of liability provision. Medicare payment under this limitation of liability provision is dependent upon 2 primary factors. So first, the claims for the services or items furnished must have been denied for specific reasons. And second, the factor in determining if Medicare payment is made under the limitation on liability provision is whether the beneficiary and or the provider, practitioner, physician, or other supplier knew or could reasonably have been expected to know that the items or services were not covered. Where items or services are denied for one of the specific reasons and the other conditions described above are met, the Medicare program makes payment when neither the beneficiary nor the provider, practitioner, or supplier knew and could not reasonably be expected to have known that the items or services were not covered. The limitation on liability applies to specific denials. You can find a detailed explanation in the IOM publication 100-4 of the Claims Processing Manual, Chapter 30. Some denials which apply for services could be services found to not be reasonably and necessary for the diagnosis or treatment of illness or injury or to improve the functioning of a malformed body member. This includes a reduction in payment because a service was deemed to be a higher level than was reasonable and necessary. Also, frequency limits. Frequencies limited services, sometimes such as testing, and we can think about the testing that we see on a daily basis now. Some testing there are not frequency limits, some there are. So we have to make sure that we're aware that if we're falling out of that frequency limit, do we have a medically reasonable diagnosis, and or there's an expectation that if we did it, that test too many times than what's allowed, that we would not be able to be paid for that service. Also, proven clinical efficacy. If a service is considered investigational, experimental, or of questionable usefulness, this service may also be denied as not reasonable and necessary. So, for example, like acupuncture is one that's considered experimental or investigational in the diagnosis or treatment of illness or injury. So these claims deny because the procedure or treatment was deemed proven to be effective by the payer, deemed not to be Okay, so that we have the presumption of beneficiary knowledge. And here, Medicare presumes that the beneficiary doesn't know that the services are not covered. A beneficiary statement that they didn't know without evidence otherwise is acceptable for that limitation of liability. This means without written evidence that the beneficiary was notified, the patient cannot be held responsible for denials where limitation of liability applies. So the advanced beneficiary notice is used as evidence that knowledge of this to the beneficiary has been given and that they are now liable for that. So we're explaining that in this, in this instance, we know or presume to know that this is not going to be a covered service, and therefore by having the advanced beneficiary notice signed, then we can, have that as documentation to say to Medicare, we knew it wasn't going to be covered. We gave the patient the option. They wanted to continue to have it with the understanding they knew they would have to pay for it. Medicare's initial determination assumes that you know the likely Medicare denials, right? So we know the likelihood of what is denied and what's not, what would not be denied. So we know it's our responsibility as the practice is to make sure that we know, what those frequency limits are, what, maybe diagnoses aren't covered for those tests, so that we are able to then educate our patients with that knowledge as well to know. So if the doctor requesting a test to be performed, but we know that it's not going to be a covered service, we need to inform that patient ahead of time with that advanced beneficiary notice. So with those denials, we are held liable for claims where limitation of liability applies. Bar is very high to prove you didn't know Medicare will deny a service. You are held to the standard of knowing, understanding, and applying Medicare law, regulation, rules, and policy. It is assumed that you keep up with any changes. Prior knowledge of Medicare coverage can show through many different means. The only way to protect the practice is to properly issue ABNs when limitation of liability applies to your service. An advanced beneficiary notice, or ABN, is a written notice which you give to a Medicare beneficiary. The purpose of the ABN is to inform a beneficiary that Medicare probably will not pay for specific items or services on that occasion or date of service. This notice allows the patient to make an informed decision whether or not to receive the items or services for which he or she might have to pay for out of pocket or through other insurance. For Medicare, you must use the CMS approved form, and notices not using the mandatory form may be ruled defective. So Medicare requires that you use their specific form. You must maintain the ABN in the patient's medical record and also provide a copy of that ABN to the patient for their records as well. So when should we use an ABN? We would want to use one whenever you offer a Medicare patient a service that you know or could reasonably have known is not medically necessary. Then you are required to notify the patient in writing before performing the test or service. So it's very important to note that you have to have the ABN signed prior to performing that service. And the patient does have a right to refuse the services at that point, right? Even though it's recommended, that's why you're giving them the choice. You're informing them of that. You must advise the patient on what you expect Medicare, why you expect Medicare to deny the service. And that's part of what we put on the document, which we'll be reviewing here shortly. The beneficiary or the authorized representative must be able to comprehend the notice, and we have to use clear language when completing the form. So we want to avoid using our medical jargon or abbreviations that only we understand, because this is for the patient, right? This ABN is for your patient's knowledge. So if I put something in there that is, an abbreviation or some technical medical jargon, how do I expect that my patient understands exactly, what is the reason why that's going to be denied and what that test or service reasonably is, right? Sometimes we use the more technical term, which really doesn't mean a lot to the patient. And so let's put it in the language that is more understandable to them. Without a properly signed ABN, a service that has been denied due to medical necessity cannot be billed to the patient. So if we have a service that we know was going to deny for medical necessity, the patient still wanted it. If we didn't fill out that ABN or complete it correctly, when we submit that claim in and we get that denial back saying it's due to medical necessity, you cannot bill the patient for that service at that point because you don't have a valid ABN. So when are we not to use an ABN? So many times people think we can just use an ABN, let's just have everybody sign one so that across the board, then we're covered. Well, you're not allowed to do that. So when we're not going to use it is if you expect Medicare is going to pay for the service, right? So we under our knowledge, within reason, we know that this is going to be paid. So we're not going to ask them to sign an ABN. We don't want to have them just signed on a routine basis. Or to a beneficiary in a medical emergency or under great duress. We're never going to, stop. Oh, you need this emergent procedure, but wait, we got to have you sign the ABN, right? We have to think about those things as well. You should never obtain a signature from a patient on a blank ABN and then complete it later. That's absolutely not allowed. You have to fill it out. You have to explain it. There's parts that they have to fill out and sign. So we want to make sure that, that you're completing them appropriately. When we say routine, we mean that a physician or supplier should not give an ABN for a patient for no specific reason. This is considered a generic ABN, and giving an ABN for all service or claims is not an acceptable practice. That is considered a blanket ABN, and we cannot do that. Issuing ABNs in these situations may cause Medicare to find your ABNs defective, and this will invalidate all issued ABNs, and the practice will no longer benefit from the limitation of liability provisions. Expectations. So there are expectations to issuing a routine ABN that apply to a Medicare Part B. If there's a national coverage decision that a particular service is not reasonable and medically necessary, an ABN may be issued on a routine basis, such as a vitamin B12 injection for chronic fatigue syndrome. In the because box, you should indicate that the Medicare will never pay for this type of service. And if the patient has other insurance that will pay for this service, then you submit the claim to Medicare for the denial and then resubmit to that secondary insurance. If the service is considered to be experimental or investigational, an ABN should be issued to the patient. In the because box, you should indicate Medicare does not pay for this service, which is considered to be experimental or investigational. When any item or service is furnished for which Medicare has established a statutory regulation, frequency limit on coverage, or a frequency limitation on coverage on basis of national coverage decision or on the basis of local medical review policy, because all beneficiaries may be at risk of having their claims denied in those circumstances, you may routinely give an ABN to a beneficiary. Medicare does not cover everything. The Social Security Act, the basis of Medicare law, specifically excludes certain services from coverage. In these cases, the limitation of liability provisions do not apply. It is not required to obtain an ABN. On this slide, there are some examples of statutorily non-covered services. Notice that routine eye care, eyeglasses, examinations, and the purpose of prescribing, fitting, or changing eyeglasses and refractions are not covered. While a signed ABN is not needed, it is good customer service to inform the patient that these services are not covered. An ABN can be given voluntarily and does not need to be signed by the patient. So, I think about our refractions, and we have this happen a lot, right? Where we know Medicare is not going to pay for that refraction. And it's just a matter of getting the patients to understand that that's not a covered service and that they would be responsible for it. Because it is statutorily a non-covered service, we're not required to get an ABN for that in order to bill the patient for that service. So, that's just kind of an instance of where, could you imagine if we'd have an ABN for every single refraction that we do on a daily basis? That, that's kind of crazy, right? So thinking about that, now think of some other services that you might do that maybe they're never going to pay for. At that point, that's something that you wouldn't need an ABN for. But if there's a chance that they could pay for it, then we would need to have an ABN. An ABN requirement applies both to services you refer and services you order, such as laboratory tests and other diagnostic tests performed elsewhere. The testing facility depends on you to supply the completed ABN in order to establish the authority to collect from the beneficiary if the claim is denied based on lack of medical necessity. For example, let's say that a physician orders blood work for a patient. The test is sent to the laboratory, which is a separate entity from the physician's office. The lab test denies as not medically necessary. Since the lab was the entity billing for the test and they do not have an ABN on file signed by the patient, then the lab is held liable and cannot bill the patient. It is the responsibility of the billing entity to make sure that an ABN has been issued and signed when services may deny due to medical necessity. To avoid calls and complaints from these facilities, it would be good practice to attach a copy of the ABN to the order form. We have guidance for special situations. So here we have a laser vision correction in conjunction with cataract surgery. In this example, an ABN should be provided. We would want to list the denial for Medicare never pays for this type of service. And then what was our basis? So our basis was on the National Coverage Determination, the NCD, for refractive keratoplasty, 80.7. And then the beneficiary should select their option that we're going to show you here in a little bit at the bottom, and then they sign. Here's another example. The patient elects an ACIOL or a PCIOL. These are your premium lenses, right? These are never covered by Medicare. It's patient responsibility. So an ABN should be provided with the reason of Medicare, again, never pays for this type of service. And then we have the basis on the CMS ruling, and then beneficiary should select that option that they want, that service, and then sign it as well. An ABN must meet certain requirements to be valid. It must be written in lay language, right? We talked about that, not having the medical jargon in there or the abbreviations. The ABN must specify the service likely to be denied. There must be reasons for believing Medicare will deny that payment. It should be hand-delivered by a qualified notifier. Telephone notice is not sufficient evidence of proper notice. And the ABN must be received and comprehended by the beneficiary or authorized representative. It must be delivered far enough in advance of the services for the beneficiary to make a rational, informed consumer decision without undue pressure. Last-minute notification can be considered coercive, and the notice will be defective. An ABN must be delivered by a qualified notifier. The regulations define a qualified notifier as the provider that will furnish or order the items and or services. The definition includes practice staff and employees. Have you ever been in a clinic, or does your clinic currently have your ABN signed at the front desk? That's not an acceptable place to have your ABN signed, because the front desk staff may not be aware of the service that they're going to have at that time, or whether or not it's going to be covered. So it needs to be the qualified notifier. That way they can explain it to them. They can explain the procedure, why it's not going to be covered. And they'll have that information to be able to educate that patient in a better way. So your ABNs should never be signed at the front desk. Regulations also state the beneficiary must have confidence in and rely upon the accuracy and credibility of the notice. A notifier must be able to respond to beneficiary questions and help with the understanding of the ABN. They must also be able to explain the reason Medicare may not pay for this service. It is not acceptable to respond to questions with "I don't know," "I'm not sure," or similar phrases, right? So we have to make sure that, if you're going to be educating on this ABN, that you understand what it is they're signing, why they're signing it, and be able to relay that information to them. ABNs will be found defective if the notifier refuses to answer questions or fail to properly explain the contents of the notice. The ABN contains an agreement to pay language, which means when properly executed, the beneficiary is on notice that Medicare will not pay. The beneficiary has two legitimate choices: to obtain the service and be prepared to pay out of pocket, that is, personally or by another insurance coverage, or do not obtain the service. That's their two choices. They can have it and understand they have to pay for it, or they can refuse that service and they don't have to get it, right? The beneficiary cannot properly refuse to sign the ABN at all and still demand the item or service. So you can have a patient who wants to have the service but refuses to sign the ABN. And if the beneficiary then refuses to sign a properly executed ABN, the practice should consider not furnishing the item or service unless the consequences, such as health and safety of the patient or civil liability in case of harm, are such that it is not an option. Additionally, the notifier may notate on the ABN and have that notation witnessed, indicating the circumstances and persons involved. Your EMR system may have an ABN that is viewed on an electronic screen before signing. If an electronic ABN is used, the beneficiary must be given the option of requesting a paper issuance if that is what they prefer. The beneficiary can digitally sign the form regardless of whether paper or electronic version is issued. The beneficiary must be given a paper copy of the signed ABN to keep for his or her own records. So once that ABN has been executed appropriately, signed, and that now we're going to print that out, if we do it electronically, to give them a copy of that as well for their records. There are modifiers which apply to ABNs as well. The GA modifier should be used when an item or service is expected to be denied as not reasonable and necessary, and an advanced beneficiary notice ABN was given to the beneficiary. So for example, after having a patient sign an ABN, you furnish the service covered by Medicare that is likely to be denied as not medically necessary by Medicare. In this situation, where coverage may be limited to certain diagnosis, an ABN would be required. We have the GY modifier, which should be used when billing for items or services that are statutorily excluded or do not meet the definition of any Medicare benefit. All services reported with the GY modifier will be denied by Medicare. For example, a patient receives a routine exam. A routine exam is a program exclusion and therefore not covered by Medicare benefit. So the GY would be appropriate. And we lastly have the GZ, and this modifier is used when an item or service is expected to be denied as not reasonable and necessary, and an ABN was not signed by the beneficiary. For example, when you realize too late, only after furnishing the service, that you should have given the patient an ABN. The claim will be reviewed by Medicare like any other claim, and it may or may not be denied. If payment is made, the presence of the GZ is irrelevant. So GY, they're never going to pay it. GZ is the may or may not, right? So you want to make sure that you're putting these modifiers on your claims. And if your billing staff is not notified, you need to set up a process, right? So either when you're having the ABN signed, having something put in the documentation so that the billing staff knows that the ABN's there to look at it, make sure it's appropriately filled out, and then go ahead and add the modifiers. If not, then your billing staff should be trained on the typical things that you're going to have the ABN signed, right? Same as you. And then they should, when they are billing for those services, they should go in and look to see, do we have an appropriate ABN on file? And if we do, we need to put the modifiers on. Okay, so this is a copy of the CMS standardized ABN form. And so we're going to discuss each section of the form and how to appropriately fill it out. The current ABN form is the CMS R131. This form is mandatory, and you should not use any other notice for Medicare patients. The form is available in English and Spanish, and the ABN must be a single page. There are options to customize the form, but they are very limited. Certain sections of the ABN can be completed before delivery. So you want to make sure that you're using the most up-to-date form. So you can go out to CMS's website and pull the most appropriate form, most up-to-date. CMS provides specific directions on the form. You must ensure that the beneficiary can read the ABN. This means providing the notice in the preferred language of the beneficiary, in extra large print, or supplying an interpreter to translate for you. Typed or printed information should not use italics or any font that is difficult to read. An Arial or Arial narrow font is, or a similar readable font in the font size range of 10 to 12 point is what's recommended. Black or dark blue ink on a white background is strongly recommended as well. A visually high contrast combination of dark ink on a pale background is required. Low contrast combinations and block shading are prohibited. Handwritten insertions must be legible. In all cases, both the original and copies of ABNs must be legible and high contrast. When Spanish language ABNs are used, the user should make insertions on the form in Spanish to the best of their ability. If this is impossible, the user needs to take steps as necessary to ensure the beneficiary understands the notice. So if you take a look at the at one of the ABN forms, the top part, which I have shown here, blanks A, B, and C. This is the header of the notice, and it must be completed by the notifier prior to delivering the ABN. Okay, so we have to have the notifier. So who, that would be, you know, your company name, right? You can have your logo at the top of it, patient name, and then their identification number as well. You must place the practice name, address, and telephone number, including TTY number when needed, at the top of the notice. This information may be a logo with the required information at the top of the notice by typing, handwriting, pre-printed labels, or other means. For B, if this is the patient name, you must enter the first and last name of the beneficiary receiving the notice, and a middle initial should also be used if there is one on the beneficiary's Medicare card. The ABN will not be invalidated by a misspelling or missing initial, as long as the beneficiary or representative recognizes the name listed on the notice as that of the beneficiary. Blank C is the identification number. Notifiers may enter the identification number for the beneficiary that helps to link the notice with a related claim. The absence of an identification number does not invalidate the ABN. An internal filing number created by the notifier, such as the medical record number, may also be used. Medicare numbers or Social Security numbers must not appear on the notice. Then we move into the body of the ABN. The body is blanks D, E, and F, and these blanks can be populated before delivery of the notice. D is items or services. So the large blank D must list all specific names of the potentially non-covered items or services. Remember that lay language must be used. For example, it would be inappropriate to use scanning computerized ophthalmic diagnostic imaging posterior segment with the interpretation and report unilateral or bilateral retina. Better language would be computerized imaging of the retina. In addition, acronyms such as OCT should not be used. CPT codes without explanation must not be used. And note that there are a total of 7 blank D fields. All D fields must be completed on the ABN in order for the notice to be considered valid. You can populate all of the blank D fields in advance when the general descriptor such as items or services is used. Blank E is reason why Medicare won't pay, okay? So this is when we believe Medicare will not cover the service. Beneficiary friendly language must be used. Examples include Medicare does not pay for this test for your condition. Medicare does not pay for this test as often as such as denied for frequency, right? Or Medicare does not pay for experimental or research use tests. There must be one reason for each service listed in blank D, and the same reason may be applied to multiple items when it is appropriate. Blank F is your estimated cost. So an estimated cost is required so that the beneficiary can make an informed decision about the services. CMS expects a reasonable estimate should be within $100 or 25% of the actual cost. Multiple items or services that are routinely bundled can be a single estimate. So you want to make sure that you're checking with your billing staff each year to make sure where you're at within your cost of the services to make sure that you're not going, that you fall within that range. Blank G is options. So this is options for the beneficiary to choose. You are not allowed to pre-select an option. The beneficiary or representative must choose only one option. However, at the beneficiary's request, you may enter the beneficiary's selection if he or she is physically unable. In that instance, you would note the ABN in that situation. In cases where the beneficiary wants some services but not others, use separate ABNs. If the beneficiary cannot or will not make a choice, the notice should be noted. For example, beneficiary refused to choose an option. A claim must be submitted to Medicare when option 1 is selected. This will result in a payment decision that can be appealed. A beneficiary may need an official Medicare decision to file a claim with a secondary insurance. Option 1 should be selected in this case. Option 2, the beneficiary may select this option if they want to receive the service but want to pay out of pocket. It is important that the beneficiary understand that no claim should be filed with Medicare and no appeal rights are afforded. Option 3 should be selected when they do not want the service. So a patient says they do not want the service. You do not need to provide the services, but it is important to understand that there are no appeal rights when selecting option 3. Blank H is for additional information. So this is used for additional clarifications or notations. For example, the dated signature of a witness is entered here. Do not add notations to other sections unless it is allowed by CMS. And blank I is our signature. The beneficiary representative must sign the notice to indicate that he or she has received the notice and understands its contents. If a representative signs on behalf of a beneficiary, he or she should write out representative in parentheses after his or her signature. The representative's name should be clearly legible or noted in print. You should never have a beneficiary sign a blank or incomplete ABN. It is not acceptable to contact the beneficiary after the services are performed to sign and date the ABN. So you kind of get one shot. Like you have to fill it all out before they get the service, and it has to all be correct. You can't go back and make changes after later on to it. The beneficiary or representative must also write the date he or she signed the ABN. If the beneficiary has a physical difficulty with writing and requests assistance in completing this blank, the date may be inserted. You must not complete the date prior to delivery of the ABN. In addition, do not accept an undated ABN. Undated ABNs are considered incomplete, and the practice will not be able to bill for the denied services. It is not acceptable to contact the beneficiary after the services are performed to sign and date the ABN. And then we have the disclosure statement. That's in the footer of the notice and are required to be included on the documentation, on the document. It is not acceptable to remove or alter this information.
Thank you, Jackie. I was going to give just 2 quick updates of some things that are going on, and then we will go through the questions that have been submitted. So if you have any, please go ahead and send those in, and we'll get to those in just a second. For our next webinar that we have scheduled, it is with Matt Jensen, who is the CEO at Vance Thompson Vision, and he is going to be talking about why your staff is leaving, the importance of corporate culture. So this is approved for 1 hour of ASOA Category A CEO credit. So if you have not signed up yet, definitely go to our website at icareleaders.com, sign up so you can earn that credit. And the other item I wanted to mention is for any of the clients that we have on the phone, our summit registration is still open. Again, we're going to be at the Gaylord Rockies August 2nd through the 4th. And if you bring 3 or more staff, you can get a $50 rebate off of each registration. And if you go to our website, you'll be able to see the full agendas for each of our software tracks, in addition to all of the general sessions. And Jackie will actually be one of our speakers there. So if you'd like to meet her, she will definitely be there and happy to answer any questions you may have. Okay, I will turn my attention now to the questions. First one that came in is, does an ABN need to be signed if we know a patient's deductible has not been met and they will be billed for an exam after Medicare denial?
Okay, so ABN, so you would not need an ABN because the patient knows they have a deductible. That's their responsibility. And so the Medicare is going to, when they process that claim, they are going to make that patient responsibility. So there's no way that the Medicare would deny that and not have the patient pay it, right? Make it not patient responsibility. So an ABN is not required there.
Okay. Next question is, can the ABN be two-sided?
No, it has to be one single page.
Okay, next
page.
one.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, perfect. Next one is, are attachments allowed to the ABN?
No, they are not. you would want to use multiple, right? So if you can't fit everything on one, you would want to use a multiple, if it's multiple services, then you would want to, use additional ABNs.
Okay. Next one, I can answer this one. Was this ABN webinar available for AAPC credit? This webinar did not go through the accreditation process. So this one is not, but our June webinar is accredited with the ASOA. Next question is an ABN necessary for a premium lens if it is not billed to Medicare?
So I would have an ABN signed for those premium lenses, because if the patient requests that it gets sent to Medicare, or they send it into Medicare or call Medicare about it, you want to have the backup that you explain to them that you did not, that it was not a covered service, and they understood that and agreed.
Okay, next question is, if we are not providers of Medicaid and a patient knows this and they choose to see the doctor still, do they need an ABN?
I'm sorry, repeat that one again.
Sure. If we are not providers of Medicaid and a patient knows and they choose to still see the doctor anyways, do they need an ABN?
So Medicare is still going to deny it, but then within what your Medicare or Medicaid requirements are, you would not be able to bill that patient, depending on what the rules are in your state. Did that make sense? So you can still have an ABN signed, but I can't say that that's going to still allow you to bill the patient based off your Medicaid rules.
Got it. Okay. We're about at time, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. If any of the questions were not addressed, we will be following up with you within the next week. And feel free to check us out on Twitter for highlights of this webinar. Thank you for your time.